All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending this and for giving us some of your time to talk about attribution. I'm Travis Scholes. I'm the EVP of Advanced Advertising at Paramount, where we've been very focused on understanding the performance capabilities of television and how we can measure those. And I'm here with Lindsay, who is the SVP of Client Data Science at iSpot, and has been one of the, frankly, more impressive and key players in our journey. So we're here to have a little bit of a conversation around the state of attribution, how it's kind of tying into a lot of the measurement evolution we've been seeing in the industry. What are the challenges? What are the watch-outs? But as we think about it, really measurement, Lindsay, has shifted in this industry heavily, especially in the last 5 years, as content distribution, viewership fragmentation, all of these things have affected how we have to think about video-based advertising. As you've seen some of these trends, and we talk a lot about things like reach frequency, how do you see those trends playing out in the outcome measurement space?
Sure, of course. So as you mentioned, right, all of you know, viewership is fragmented. We're all watching and consuming content on streaming apps, social media even, linear TV. And as we're doing each one of those things, we need to kind of measure this properly. And what we've seen, I guess, from like an iSpot measurement perspective, people are struggling with is still looking at through the lens of a single platform, right? So the changes are we want to measure things as one holistic view, but people are still kind of stuck in the past of, let me measure my linear attribution, let me measure my digital platforms, let me measure my social media, and then try to understand how it all fits together instead of a kind of holistic approach. And even with this, if we start the silos, we then want to see, how is this moving the needle? So we don't just want to care about we do care about like the full funnel. We want to understand, are the campaigns driving interest? Are they driving people to go to the website? Are they driving foot traffic? Are they driving actual sales? Actual sales are what you want for the most part, right? You spend a bunch of money on a media campaign. Are you getting any return on that money? So that's the goal. And people are wanting these faster, right? So can we measure these campaigns quickly? Can we measure them holistically across multiple platforms? And are they driving these tangible outcomes? So they want the scale, they want to know their return, and they want to make quick decisions. I've also seen, as Paramount and other programmers and brands, they are using these insights to actually inform their decisions to move the needle. So in the past, perhaps, while there were some data-driven insights people were using, they may wait a while, make their strategy change maybe next year. They're like, we'll deal with this in the future. But now it's quick change, right? What's working, what's not working? Let's make progress happen now. Let's make our marketing dollar work more quickly and make an impact.
So you mentioned that things are still really functioning in silos in a lot of ways. And I kind of want to pull on that thread a little bit because, when we talk a lot to measurement companies, I'm sure this has been folks' experience in the space at large, you often see that attribution companies are either specialists in digital, specialists in linear. It's not necessarily like impression measurement or some of these things where everybody's talking cross-platform. Is there some unique challenge in attribution outcome measurement to doing this cross-platform? Like, why haven't folks cracked this code writ large?
Sure. So I think you're exactly right. There's many different vendors can specialize in one of the linear outcome or linear impressions, streaming impressions, digital outcomes. Maybe they are focusing on web visits or geolocation visits or sales. And when you work with any vendor, these different footprints have different biases in them. So let's take, for example, outcome data sources. So if you're looking at sales purchases, some of them might be tracked through loyalty cards. In order to get a loyalty card, you have to sign up. So there's some innate bias of who's willing to sign up and go shop at those stores. Some of them may be receipt-based, where you scan a receipt and submit it. That also has its own bias. Like, you have to be willing to scan a receipt. Not everybody is going to do this. So one of the things you need to look out for is, are you working with a measurement provider that understands the biases of all of your different data sets? So the outcome data sets have their own biases. And then in general, digital footprints, like streaming apps, right? How that data is tracked has its own bias, right? Typically an IP-based track. But then when you want to match it to outcome, there's going to be various match loss. How is the ID graph mapped to the outcome vendors? When you're working with linear data, that can be tracked on IP address or set-top box. Those both work differently. You need to marry this impressions data from digital. You'll need to marry it to the linear viewing. And these kinds of things are quite tricky, right? You now have 3, 4, 5 different footprints to account for different biases. You need to be able to map the IDs of each of these all together. You need to see, okay, Lindsay saw an ad on Paramount Plus. She saw an ad on linear TV. She saw an ad on XYZ platform. And then she went to McDonald's and got like 3 cheeseburgers or something. I don't know, but I want to understand what was my history. And I don't want to, it's better if you can map that deterministically. I don't want to guess what I did see, what I didn't see, where I did go, what I didn't go. So this deterministic mapping and getting those IDs correctly matched is key.
So let's dig in a little bit, because I 100% agree, right? Advertisers just really care about outcomes, right? All of these media metrics ends up, no one has ever heard a CPG advertiser go on an earnings call and report like, oh, like my reach frequency average is going down. It's always about how many things that I actually sell. But one of the things that I think is a unique challenge when we start thinking about cross-platform, and we see this a lot of places, to the point around deterministic matching, there is no such thing as a census-level linear data set, right? We've seen a emergence of big data and an evolution towards big data in that space, but you're still talking, on the top end, 40, 50 million households. So it's not all of the United States. Digital obviously is very different, right? That is a naturally census measured level place. So given the fact that like those two things are so inherently different, because one requires you to project out and to model to the full footprint, well, one's already sort of there. How are you thinking about deterministic matching? How are you combining those things?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with the linear footprint, you have to first figure out what are your footprints. So for example, so say you're marrying 3 different linear footprints together, some IP-based and some set-top box-based. You need to first commingle them and deduplicate impressions. So what I'm watching on my platform, maybe it's tracked through a Vizio device, an LG device, and Comcast, right? You want to make sure that we're not tracking 3 impressions at once. And then I'll take this data and I can understand, okay, these are the impressions Lindsay saw. I only saw 1 impression at that point. And then I can project this out. So if I'm tracking my impression, maybe Travis isn't tracked on my footprint. Perhaps my data set skews more female. Then I need to unweight or weight this bias up to match the US Census. So what we do is say our footprint skews female. Maybe it skews geographically. Maybe it also skews to certain incomes, right? Depending on the data that we subscribe. What we want to do is make sure the distributions across all of our data match to the total U.S. So what you can do is you can take the U.S. Census. You all probably fill out a census every so many years. There's also different surveys. So there's some surveys that give you attributes around TV viewing data, like the ARF-Dash survey. A few other ones that give you the number of TVs in a home. Typical viewing types in the household. Is it a streaming household? Is it a traditional linear viewing household? Is it a combination? So you take your linear footprint and you want to weight up to what the national average is. So this can give you an understanding of what is the reach, impressions, frequency for different cuts of the audience. And then what you want to do is you can then scale this to the full footprint and marry it to this digital data, right? So then I can say, okay, so while I'm maybe not tracking Travis's linear and digital data, we can use some modeling to then map him to a similar viewer who is watching on linear data and use his digital footprint and this similar linear footprint to match together. So like, okay, a household very similar to Travis across hundreds of attributes, look very same. We can see their impressions viewing and get a good estimate on what the total reach is. This gives you a good idea on incremental reach, unique reach, like where are these platforms perhaps overreaching somebody. We've all been hit with a lot of ads on perhaps digital sometimes. You see the same ad over and over. So we get a better understanding of that true frequency.
So one of the things that I think is interesting is we talk a lot about modeling and how you're combining these footprints and considering biases. One of the common, I think, complaints we hear from advertisers, especially when it comes to attribution measurement, especially as it comes to ROAS, right, is, well, if I add up all of my ROAS metrics from all of my partners, it's like 4x my sales, right? So something is must be amiss here. There are a lot of footprints that you don't have access to, right? A lot of the walled gardens, et cetera. So how do you start to think about, from an advertiser perspective, look, even if I can understand from a streaming television perspective with good digital signal, I have a good linear provider, but I still have these data sets that are naturally kind of firewalled from that. How should advertisers start to think about understanding the full impact of their marketing and which channels are really driving the needle versus just kind of looking at all of these things in isolation and getting 4x ROAS?
Sure, I think that's a great question. So you can, I would say, try to measure as holistically as possible, right? So as many platforms as you can combine, do your measurement study there, and you can only work with what you have, right? So we might not be able to ever measure every single place your ad campaign is airing in one study. That's just not feasible in today's day and age. But if I get a good understanding of, okay, all of maybe my streaming apps, my linear programming can all be measured here together. I understand what's working, what's not working. And then you can go work with your walled gardens and understand what's working and what's not. I think the next question you should ask them is start to understand what is their methodology, right? What are their biases in their data? What are their assumptions? How are they calculating ROAS? How are they calculating lift? How are they calculating conversion rate? What are they doing to fix the footprint issues on both sides? Because then you can start to do better comparisons, right? So the struggle is when you work with different data sets and different providers, people might make up completely different methodology. There's a lot of solid methodology out there, but you need to be able to understand it. You need to be able to act on it correctly. And that only works with conversations. Have open conversations with these vendors, with your partners, understand what they're doing to the data so that you're making the correct assumptions. And then you know how to add these numbers together. You don't get 4x. If you know this vendor accounts for this vendor is accounting for this, maybe you do your own adjustment factors based on their different methodologies and you're getting to your true ROAS number.
How does MMM modeling then play a role in a lot of this? So I know when we talk about attribution, especially the work that we do together, it's often very campaign-based. We're trying to look at sort of Paramount Media. We're looking at trying, in the context of the world, but MMM is obviously a huge thing. MMM is certainly seeing a resurgence right now, I think, especially in response to a lot of the privacy regulation and some of these things. We've seen multiple new MMM algorithms, open source, put out into the market. To the point around understanding how these things are all working together, how does MMM and campaign level attribution, how should we think about feathering these things together?
Sure, this is a good question. So MMMs you can think of as more kind of high level trending, right? What's working, what's moving the needle across your different marketing avenues. And they're more of a holistic trending analysis that gives you good guidance. I would recommend it as kind of what platforms are working, what's not working, where should you be shifting dollars over time. Whereas the more deterministic models and what Travis is talking about, we do a lot of campaign attribution. It gives you breakdowns of what networks, what are the lift across your different networks, your different creatives, your different ads, your different platforms, and very granular results. I think my hair is hitting that, sorry. It gives you lift across very more granular details. You can break it down with advanced audiences even, so you can say, okay, what strategic targets are actually working? So I would think the MMMs are more, here's your high-level guidance, and then if you see in the MMM, hey, my streaming platforms seem to be working, let's dig into them. Let's do this more refined study that we're talking about, more campaign granular breakdown using a more deterministic style attribution. I can understand what audiences are working, and you can refine that campaign more precisely.
So I'm gonna openly steal an example from my head of sales. But would you then say these things kind of feather together? Like if you're painting a house, it's like the difference between a roller and a brush. You kind of need them both to get the job done.
Yeah, that's a great example actually. I like that a lot. You want the tiny details in the corners. You don't want a big roller that looks sloppy.
So. Speaking of privacy, and I know a lot of these trends have been shifting in response to regulation, how do you see some of the regulation impacting the world of attribution measurement? What do you think is the likely impact? What's going to go away? What's going to get better? And what are some of the trends that we've already been seeing happening as a response?
Sure, there are. I think we don't know what we don't know in the future, right? There's going to be data that we no longer have access to in the future. Perhaps the way we're matching IDs, bringing in data is also going to change, right? Perhaps cookies or IPs, we can discuss, go down long rabbit holes on all of these discussions. Also, what is tracked on your browser, what's tracked when you, with your apps and your cell phone. All of these things are going to change over time. So I think let's work with what we have today the best and then set ourselves up for success. So make sure that we're not wholly dependent on one matching algorithm on something that could vanish right over time. So, or don't base all of our studies on one outcome vendor whose footprint might continually shrink over time. So build your measurement studies and your campaigns give yourself multiple options, right? Set yourself up for success, understand how to navigate around potential shifts in the data realm.
Well, what have you been seeing as these trends have emerged and as this stuff is moving cross-platform? What have you been seeing that's working well, and what have you been seeing where you're like, we're not even going to bother to invest in these types of things because this is never going to pan out?
That's a good question. I think what's working well is, I guess, finding good partners, obviously, like Paramount, who want to actually move the industry forward with attribution, right? Build things at scale, make repeatable measurements, be willing to work with multiple vendors. Don't just silo yourself off to where we are only doing perhaps outcome-based attribution working with one key vendor. Like, let's make it scalable across things. Because I think the main thing is just like, don't set yourself up for failure.
All right. So I want to thinking about some of the things that are working well. It's interesting because we certainly have talked to a lot of attribution folks, a lot of folks in this space. They're all kind of doing things a bit differently. And I'm sure for anyone that's sat through kind of an RFP process, certainly there are some examples where folks come out and they explain what they're doing and you're like, ugh. And some folks, you're like, wow, that seems really neat. But to your point around, you have to understand the methodology. You have to understand what these folks are doing, how you should combine it. Like, when you're in that room, right, if you're not a data scientist that spent over a decade running attribution, like, what are the questions that folks should be asking that'll kind of give them an aha moment?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there are a few things you should ask your providers when you're trying to work with a new measurement company or your same measurement company. A few things should be, what is the data that they're actually using for the study, right? Where is that data coming from? Who are the vendors and the sample size of the data? So you can run studies on all kinds of sample sizes. We all love larger sample sizes, typically give you more stable results, but you should understand the size of the sample, right? That'll give you an understanding of how much you should rely on these results moving forward. What are the biases in the footprint? So if you understand the data that they're putting into your measurement, you can ask them, okay, say the data is collected, I don't know, only in New York. Wild assumption here. But say they're like, hey, yeah, we're using a footprint, it's only in New York. Are you really gonna want them to then make the takeaway that this study is attributable to the full US? Probably not, right? And if you didn't ask that question where that data came from, you're gonna potentially make a wrong assumption in your analysis coming out of it. So understand what the data is they're doing and what bias correction they're doing. So every footprint and sample data you work with always has bias in it. Like, typically, we're not doing complete random trials of pulling data, right? Most data is opt-in these days, and the way it's collected is forced on what you buy. So I would first ask that, right? What is the bias, and how are they accounting for it? The other question is, how are they then extrapolating? So if most studies are extrapolated, you probably want them to be extrapolated to fix the biases. So what are their assumptions in the extrapolation so that you are understanding, like, if they did just extrapolate this to, say, New York, you don't want to make the assumption that this is true for Florida, California, Iowa, any other state. Completely different people there, different trends. Some other things you might want to ask about are, how do they actually match the data? So if you're looking at a cross-platform campaign where they have different footprints, ask them how they're treating their linear viewing data. How are they treating their streaming data? How are they treating their outcome data? And how do they marry it all? Like, what ID spine are they matching to? Do they have their own ID spine? Do they use a deterministic model to tie them together? Are they using a probabilistic model? If so, what is the modeling behind it? You can start asking questions. While some of these questions may have some IP that the measurement provider might not want to share, a lot of these are pretty general questions, right? You can understand, what are the footprints? Are you doing anything? And they should be able to give you some clarity into these, because these are really going to help you understand the takeaways you should have. You could also ask them for some studies. So, like, in the past with their models, what are the trends they've seen? Are they seeing stable results? And you yourself should look, are results stable over time? Right? If your results wildly change over time for the similar campaigns, it may be something with the provider that is unsteady, right? You're like, did the footprint change? Is their algorithm not accounting for some biases? So look for stability in your numbers, and if it's not there, ask them why, and they can help you understand it. So there's just a few things. Get in the weeds, communicate well with your providers, understand what's happening so that you can make informed decisions and help your team move forward correctly.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about the attribution space is when you see an attribution study, it never says you got 6 more attributions, right? Like, that's not a metric that people talk about. There's a whole bunch of different metrics that are produced from a wide variety of providers, from ROAS. I would say that the new hotness is incrementality, right? Like understanding, hey, like how can we determine whether or not these sales would have happened without this media spend? A lot of these things then are kind of being measured differently in different places, and we get to one of the most common complaints, I think, from media buyers, which is, well, if I can't look at something similarly across my entire buy, I don't know how to judge all of these things in isolation. If you were gonna, well, first of all, I guess if you were gonna pick one metric for your business, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. If I had all the data in the world, I would probably look at lift and incrementality, but I don't look at it on its own. I think metrics on their own in silo don't give you the full answer, right? So if I look at lift, lift being, say, this campaign, maybe this creative drove a 5% lift, right, on going to McDonald's. I don't know why I'm using McDonald's, but drove 5% more people to go to McDonald's. Now, what you'd want to do is understand, what is that 5% relative to? Like, what was the reach of the campaign? If only 10 people were reached, a 5% lift is nothing, right? Like, you moving the needle, not at all. If the campaign had a massive reach and you're seeing a 5% lift on a really well-established account, you're like, a 5% lift is quite large, you move the needle. And then marry that with the cost of the ad spend, right? So if you spend a bunch of money, but you're only getting a 5% lift, that 5% lift equates to less than your marketing spend, something's wrong here, right? Like, you're in the business to make money, we all are. So I don't know, I typically like lift, but I like to keep it in tow with reach, conversion rate, ad spend. They all work together nicely to give you that full picture of understanding what's working. So never just pick one metric to hang your hat on. I think look at the full picture.
Given how long you've worked in this space, like especially lift incrementality, I think everybody's very focused on it. Here's an interesting question. What's a good number, right? Because I think we've all seen a report where somebody's like, oh, your campaign produced a 387% lift. It's like, oh, that feels strong, maybe not correct, right? And then sometimes you see, well, your campaign had a 0% lift, but it was actually negative, but we just don't report that because that's impossible. So like, when we're looking at a report, like, what's the range where, for a typical media spend with a typical partner, like, what should we be thinking about as reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I've seen numbers all over the place. Well, what I would do is kind of use benchmarks. So typically benchmarks on what your campaigns have been performing in the past and how it's trending over time. I would look at the trend of your own analyses for your campaign. So if I'm doing better than I was last quarter, that's a great start, right? You can also look at benchmarks for your vertical. So if I'm evaluating fast food restaurants or I'm evaluating TV tune-in or whatever I'm looking at, the list can be wildly different. Similar with car buying, right? People don't buy cars that often. Maybe some of you do, I don't know, but I personally buy a car like twice ever. So very low amount. How many times do I buy cheeseburgers? More than twice, right? So the lift associated with a car on what's expected is really different than cheeseburgers. Similarly with tune-in, and so it's all relative to like the incidence rate, so like how many people convert out of your population, and tying that to the return you're getting. So positive is good. Always go with a positive lift. That's always good. If you see a positive number, you're probably doing something good. And then I would just compare it to your own data and similar verticals. Try not to compare cross verticals. It's probably not going to be the most useful.
Let's take auto. Auto is one of my favorite categories for attribution because it is such a difficult one, right? Like, nobody goes out and buys a car tomorrow because they saw an ad for a Lexus last night, right? Like, at least, I don't know, I've never done that, and I highly doubt a lot of folks make those types of snap decisions. So when we think about attribution, a lot of times it's kind of relegated to performance media, to like very quick turning categories where you can see kind of instant buy action, very bottom funnel heavy. There is no real valid bottom funnel, I would say, in a very long purchase cycle category like auto. So how should marketers, especially for categories that perhaps have barriers to a quick turn sale, right? You're not selling a $4 cheeseburger, you're selling a $50,000 car. How should they think about attribution inside of the funnel where they kind of have to play?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's continue on the auto one. So there's a few different ways of engagement where you can see excuse me, if your ads are driving any value really, right? So if I see an ad for, I think you use Alexis, maybe the person went to the website just to better understand. I think that's engagement. That shows you a quick turn benefit, that your creative maybe was moving the needle, right? They wanted to understand more. You can also visit a dealership. Maybe you don't buy one. Once you go to the dealership, it might be more up to the salesperson to help push you to make that sale. You might just want to look and explore the car. So geolocation data is another way, more mid-funnel attribute than just upper funnel with web visit. And then there is obviously the purchase data. You can look at when a car was purchased at the dealership, through a website, either way. But that gives you an idea of autos can be looking at things through multiple points of the funnel to help understand what's engagement throughout the campaign. And the other thing is ensure that the ads help influence your behavior over time. So it's a more longitudinal study for auto campaigns. So what you want to do is if I'm trying to evaluate was my Q1 campaign effective, I'm going to want to look at similarities between people's behaviors in Q4 of the previous year, Q3. Make sure that if I'm trying to compare, say in a typical attribution study, if I was exposed to some ads in Q1 and I'm doing an exposed control-based study, right? It's like who saw ads compared to who didn't see the ads, right? What is the lift between the two? Prior to Q1, I want to ensure that those two groups have similar exposure history, right? Are they visiting the Lexus website or similarly? Were they all exposed to similar Lexus ads? Because it's a longitudinal type study, so you want to bring in all of those effects that can drive to that purchase over time. But you'd still need to make quick decisions. So I think using website visits, using different types of outcomes can help them inform where you should move the needle, what creatives are working. You can also do some surveys, right? People give response on how much they enjoyed the commercial. Was it driving them to websites or engagement? There's upper funnel type things you can also do for quick turn response.
All right, so I think we've got time for one more question. But it's been a core priority, I think, for Paramount and for a lot of traditional publishers in the video space to really tell the story that television, right, whether it's CTV, traditional linear, isn't just a top of funnel vehicle, right? It's just sort of how we've measured it. To the point around measuring your efficacy, right, from your marketing campaign at multiple stages of the funnel, how do you see that playing across, one, different verticals, and then two, different mediums, right? Like, how should we think about television as a performance vehicle as opposed to just a brand building one?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think all the platforms work together, which is why we're all here, cross-platform. Attribution is what we're talking about. But TV you use yourself as an example, right? I have seen ads on TV for cheeseburgers once again. And I have been like, I need a cheeseburger this week. That got me there. Now, it might not be as quick as I see an ad on my phone and I just push the button and then buy the cheeseburger. But, it's like, okay, I forgot how much I love them. I'm going to go. So we all know ads have an influence from TV and from our phones, from everywhere we're viewing them. So I think it's just one of the other pieces of the puzzle of what's driving you, which gets to our earlier point, measure holistically, right? We want to see what ads did somebody see on linear TV and on their streaming apps and everywhere to understand when did they make that buy. So you can start to see, oh, Lindsay saw an ad on her phone here, and then she saw it on linear TV during the football game, and then she went and bought the cheeseburger. So I would probably say, both ads had an influence on my cheeseburger behavior. Which one gave more? We'll let the data science models determine that, but both of them can play.
Really like cheeseburgers, don't you?
I stuck with one all morning.
All right, so we do actually have a little bit more time, but I think that to kind of get more pointed on that, right? What do you think is actually more impactful from a performance vehicle, right? Is it the creative, the call to action, or is it the medium that it's being portrayed in, or is it some combination of both? Are there such things as mediums that should only be considered for certain parts of the funnel?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the creatives obviously have a large impact on what somebody's going to do. And so that's, I think, pretty key. The platform it's reached on, though, I would say no platform is wrong or right. I would look at the platforms and where you're reaching the most unique audiences. Don't get rid of a platform if that's the only way you're reaching. If I can only get Travis on this platform over here, and I really think he's the next greatest thing to buy my product, make sure you're using that platform. It doesn't matter what it is, if it has like a higher call to action or like a higher rate of conversion rate or not. You won't get him if you don't reach him. So I think it's understanding your audiences, where they're uniquely reached, and then playing in that space.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay. This was great. We are out of time.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.